The morning of November 15th, 2024, began like any other at Buckingham Palace. The staff went about their usual routines, polishing the grand chandeliers and preparing for the day's scheduled events. King Charles III had awakened at his customary 6:30 a.m., as he had done for decades, but something felt different this particular morning. The weight of the crown seemed heavier than usual, and the endless corridors of the palace felt more confining than they ever had before. Charles stood at the window of his private study, gazing out at the gardens where he had spent countless hours as a young prince. The autumn leaves were falling steadily, creating a golden carpet across the perfectly manicured lawns. He remembered running through those same gardens with his sister and their laughter echoing through the air as their nannies chased after them. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago, when the responsibilities of the monarchy were nothing more than distant concepts that belonged to his mother. The king's morning briefing was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp, as it had been every day since his coronation. His private secretary, Sir Thompson, arrived precisely on time with a stack of documents that required the royal signature. There were matters of state to address, charity events to approve, and diplomatic correspondence that needed immediate attention. Charles went through the motions mechanically, signing each document with the practiced flourish he had perfected over the years. But as he signed his name for what felt like the 1,000th time that month, something inside him began to crack. The realization hit him with startling clarity that he had spent his entire life preparing for a role that he was no longer certain he wanted to fulfill. At 75 years old, he had waited longer than any heir apparent in British history to become king. And now that the crown was finally his, he found himself questioning everything he had been taught to believe about duty and service. The morning progressed with its usual parade of obligations. There was a meeting with the Prime Minister scheduled for 10 a.m., followed by a luncheon with various dignitaries and an afternoon reception for members of Parliament. Charles participated in each event with the same grace and dignity that had defined his public persona for decades, but internally he felt as though he was watching himself from outside his own body. During the meeting with the Prime Minister, they discussed the ongoing economic challenges facing the nation and the role the monarchy could play in providing stability during uncertain times. Charles listened intently and offered his insights, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his words carried little real weight. He was a figurehead, a symbol of tradition and continuity, but he wondered if that was enough to justify the enormous cost and ceremony that surrounded his every move. The luncheon was particularly challenging. He found himself seated between a foreign ambassador and a member of the House of Lords, both of whom seemed more interested in the prestige of dining at the palace than in any meaningful conversation. Charles made polite small talk about the weather and current events, but his mind wandered to thoughts of a life he might have lived if he had been born into different circumstances. After the official events concluded, Charles retreated to his private quarters for what should have been a moment of respite. Instead, he found himself pacing the length of his sitting room, unable to shake the growing sense of unease that had been building throughout the day. He picked up a photograph of his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and stared at her serene expression. She had carried the burden of the crown for over 70 years with unwavering dedication, never once publicly expressing doubt about her role or responsibilities. But Charles was not his mother. He had always been more introspective, more willing to question the status quo and challenge traditional ways of thinking. Throughout his years as Prince of Wales, he had been criticized for his outspoken views on environmental issues and social causes. Now, as king, he was expected to remain politically neutral and avoid controversial topics, but that expectation felt like a straitjacket that was slowly suffocating his authentic self. The afternoon reception proved to be the final straw. As he moved through the crowd of politicians and dignitaries, shaking hands and making pleasant conversation, Charles felt increasingly disconnected from the proceedings. These people saw him not as a person with his own thoughts and feelings, but as an institution, a living symbol of a system that many of them privately questioned but publicly supported for the sake of tradition. One particular conversation stood out among the rest. A young MP approached him with genuine enthusiasm, expressing her hope that his reign would bring about positive change for the country. Charles was touched by her sincerity, but when he began to share some of his own ideas for reform and modernization, he was quickly reminded by his equerry that such discussions were inappropriate for a public setting. That reminder hit him like a physical blow. Here was someone genuinely interested in his thoughts and opinions, yet he was constrained by protocol from engaging in the very type of meaningful dialogue that had always energized him. He realized in that moment that becoming king had not elevated him to a position of greater influence, but had instead trapped him in a gilded cage where every word was scrutinized and every action was filtered through centuries of tradition and protocol. As the reception drew to a close, Charles excused himself and returned to his private study. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to simply walk away from it all. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in his adult life, he considered the possibility that duty and personal fulfillment might not be mutually exclusive, but that perhaps true service to his country might require him to step away from the throne. The king sat down at his desk and pulled out a piece of personal stationery. He began to write, not an official document or royal decree, but a letter to himself, exploring the thoughts and feelings that had been building throughout the day. As he wrote, he felt a sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the confusion and doubt that had plagued him. He wrote about his love for his country and his genuine desire to serve its people, but also about his growing conviction that the monarchy as it currently existed was an outdated institution that no longer served the needs of a modern democracy. He wrote about his environmental concerns and his belief that climate change represented an existential threat that required bold action, not the careful neutrality expected of a constitutional monarch. Most importantly, he wrote about his need to be authentic, to speak his truth, even if it meant abandoning the comfortable certainty of royal protocol. The more he wrote, the more convinced he became that his greatest service to the nation might be to demonstrate that even the highest office in the land should not be immune from self-reflection and change. As evening approached, Charles set down his pen and read over what he had written. The words on the page represented more than just his thoughts. They were a roadmap for a decision that would shock the world and forever change the course of British history. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, knowing that the next day would bring challenges unlike any he had ever faced. That night, as he prepared for bed in the same royal chambers where countless monarchs had slept before him, Charles made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. Tomorrow, he would not simply go through the motions of being king. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward reclaiming his authentic self, regardless of the consequences. The palace staff continued their evening routines, unaware that their king was contemplating an action that would send shockwaves through the establishment and forever alter the relationship between the monarchy and the British people. As Charles finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled not with the weight of the crown, but with visions of a life lived on his own terms, guided by conscience rather than convention. Little did anyone know that within a matter of days, the man who had waited a lifetime to become king would make the unprecedented decision to walk away from it all, setting in motion a series of events that would challenge every assumption about duty, service, and the nature of leadership itself. The carefully orchestrated world of royal protocol was about to encounter something it had never faced before, a king who valued truth over tradition and authenticity over expectation. The second day dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the turbulent thoughts that had kept Charles awake for most of the night. He had made his decision in the quiet hours before dawn, but implementing it would require careful planning and consideration of the enormous consequences that would follow. The king understood that what he was contemplating had no precedent in modern British history, and the ripple effects would be felt far beyond the palace walls. Charles began the day by canceling his scheduled morning briefing, much to the surprise of his private secretary. Instead, he requested a private meeting with Sir Thompson, one of the few people in the palace whom he trusted completely. When the secretary arrived, he found the king standing by the window, still dressed in his morning robe, staring out at the gardens with an expression of profound contemplation. The conversation that followed was unlike any that had taken place in the royal chambers before. Charles spoke candidly about his growing disillusionment with the constraints of his position and his belief that the monarchy needed to evolve or risk becoming completely irrelevant. Sir Thompson listened with growing alarm as his sovereign outlined his concerns about climate change, social inequality, and the need for authentic leadership in an age of increasing cynicism about traditional institutions. What shocked Sir Thompson most was not the king's willingness to discuss these issues, but his apparent determination to act upon his convictions, regardless of the personal cost. Charles spoke about his desire to engage directly with the challenges facing the nation, to use his voice and platform to advocate for the changes he believed were necessary, even if it meant stepping outside the carefully defined boundaries of constitutional monarchy. The private secretary attempted to remind the king of his coronation oath and the sacred nature of his duty to the crown, but Charles had already considered these arguments extensively during his sleepless night. He acknowledged the weight of tradition and the expectations placed upon him, but argued that true loyalty to his subjects required him to prioritize their welfare over institutional preservation. As the morning progressed, Charles made a series of phone calls that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He contacted environmental scientists, social activists, and political reformers, not as king seeking to maintain careful neutrality, but as a concerned citizen eager to understand how he could most effectively contribute to positive change. These conversations energized him in a way that royal protocol never had, confirming his growing conviction that his current role was preventing him from making the meaningful impact he desperately wanted to achieve. The transformation in the king's demeanor did not go unnoticed by the palace staff. Those who had worked closely with him for years observed a new sense of purpose and determination that was both inspiring and concerning. Charles moved through the palace with a vitality that had been absent since his coronation, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders even before he had taken any decisive action. During lunch, which he took alone in his private dining room, Charles drafted a series of notes outlining his vision for how the monarchy might evolve to better serve the needs of the 21st century. His ideas were radical by royal standards, involving direct engagement with controversial issues, abandonment of many ceremonial functions, and a willingness to challenge government policies when they conflicted with the long-term interests of the people. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that would prove crucial to Charles's developing plans. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a prominent environmental scientist whom the king had consulted during his years as Prince of Wales, arrived at the palace for what she believed was a routine briefing on climate policy. Instead, she found herself engaged in the most extraordinary conversation of her professional career. Charles spoke with unprecedented candor about his frustration with the limitations of his position and his desire to become more actively involved in addressing the climate crisis. Dr. Mitchell was initially cautious, aware that she was treading on politically sensitive ground, but the king's genuine passion and knowledge about environmental issues gradually drew her into a frank discussion about the urgent need for leadership on these critical challenges. What emerged from their conversation was a proposal that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Charles outlined his vision for a new model of public service, one that would allow him to advocate directly for the policies and changes he believed were essential for the nation's future. Dr. Mitchell found herself becoming an inadvertent advisor to a king who was contemplating the most radical departure from royal tradition in modern history. As evening approached, Charles made another decision that further committed him to his chosen path. He contacted Prince William, knowing that his son and heir needed to understand the gravity of what was being contemplated. The phone conversation that followed was emotional and difficult, with William initially struggling to comprehend his father's intentions and the implications for the entire royal family. Charles explained his reasoning with the same passion and conviction he had shown throughout the day, emphasizing his belief that the monarchy's survival depended on its willingness to adapt and remain relevant to contemporary society. He acknowledged the burden this would place on William and the uncertainty it would create, but argued that short-term disruption was preferable to the long-term decline of an institution that refused to evolve. The conversation with his son forced Charles to confront the personal cost of his decision. He was not simply choosing to abandon his own role. He was fundamentally altering the trajectory of his family's future and potentially exposing them to unprecedented scrutiny and criticism. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but his conviction remained unshaken. That evening, Charles took an unusual step that further signaled his departure from traditional royal behavior. He dismissed his security detail and took a solitary walk through the palace gardens, something that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The freedom of movement, however brief and limited, gave him a taste of the autonomy he was seeking to reclaim. During his walk, the king encountered several palace gardeners who were working late to prepare the grounds for an upcoming state visit. Their surprise at seeing him alone and unguarded led to impromptu conversations that proved more meaningful to Charles than any of the formal interactions he had experienced in recent months. These brief exchanges with ordinary working people reminded him why he felt compelled to step away from the isolated world of royal protocol. The gardeners spoke to him not as subjects addressing their sovereign, but as fellow human beings sharing concerns about rising costs, job security, and the future they were trying to build for their families. Charles realized that these conversations represented exactly the kind of authentic human connection that his royal role had largely prevented him from experiencing. Returning to his private quarters, Charles spent the evening reviewing correspondence from citizens across the Commonwealth. The letters revealed a complex relationship between the monarchy and the people it claimed to serve. While many expressed traditional respect and affection for the institution, others questioned its relevance and cost in an era of economic uncertainty and social change. One letter in particular struck Charles with its directness and honesty. A teacher from Manchester had written to express her hope that his reign would bring about meaningful change, but also her skepticism that the constitutional constraints of monarchy would allow for the kind of bold leadership the country needed. Her words crystallized his own thoughts about the fundamental limitations of his current position. As he prepared for bed on his second day of contemplation, Charles felt a sense of peace he had not experienced since his coronation. The decision that had seemed so momentous and frightening just 24 hours earlier now felt like the natural conclusion of a lifetime of questioning and growth. He understood that the path ahead would be difficult and unpredictable, but for the first time in months, he felt aligned with his own values and convictions. The king's journal entry that night captured the essence of his transformation. He wrote about the difference between the dutiful acceptance of inherited responsibility and the active choice to serve according to one's conscience. He acknowledged that his decision would be seen as abandonment by some and liberation by others, but expressed his growing confidence that authentic leadership required the courage to chart an unknown course when traditional paths proved inadequate. As Charles finally drifted off to sleep, the palace around him continued its ancient rhythms, unaware that its sovereign was planning an action that would fundamentally alter not just his own life, but the very nature of the British monarchy itself. The next day would bring new challenges and the need to begin translating his convictions into concrete action, but he faced the future with a sense of purpose and authenticity that had been missing from his life for far too long. The third morning brought with it a sense of inevitability that Charles had not felt since his mother's funeral. He awoke not with the usual dread of another day confined by protocol, but with the clear knowledge that today would mark the beginning of his transformation from reluctant monarch to authentic advocate. The decision was no longer a possibility to be contemplated. It was a reality to be implemented. Charles began the day by requesting an emergency meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, knowing that the religious dimension of his role could not be ignored or dismissed lightly. The Archbishop arrived within hours, clearly concerned about the unusual nature of the summons and the king's recent departure from his normal schedule. What followed was perhaps the most profound theological discussion of both men's lives. The king spoke about his understanding of service and duty, but framed these concepts in terms of personal conscience rather than inherited obligation. He argued that his coronation oath, rather than binding him to preserve the monarchy unchanged, actually required him to serve the people in whatever capacity would prove most beneficial to their welfare. The archbishop listened with growing amazement as his sovereign outlined a theology of authentic leadership that prioritized moral conviction over institutional preservation. The discussion that followed challenged both men's understanding of the relationship between faith, duty, and personal integrity. Charles spoke about his belief that God's call to service might sometimes require abandoning traditional expectations in favor of more direct and meaningful engagement with the world's problems. The archbishop found himself grappling with questions he had never seriously considered about the nature of divine appointment and the possibility that even sacred institutions might need to evolve or transform. What emerged from their conversation was not agreement, but mutual respect for the complexity of the issues involved. The archbishop acknowledged the sincerity of the king's convictions while expressing his concerns about the potential consequences for the Church of England and the broader Commonwealth. Charles, in turn, demonstrated his willingness to accept responsibility for those consequences while remaining committed to his chosen path. Following the archbishop's departure, Charles made the decision to begin drafting the speech that would announce his intentions to the nation. This was not a task he could delegate to his usual speechwriters. The words needed to come from his own heart and mind, expressing his personal convictions in language that would help the public understand his reasoning. The process of writing proved more challenging than Charles had anticipated. How does one explain to a nation that has invested so much in the stability and continuity of the monarchy that their king believes those very qualities have become obstacles to effective leadership? How does one communicate the difference between abandoning duty and redefining it according to contemporary needs and values? Charles wrote draft after draft, struggling to find the right balance between respect for tradition and honest assessment of its limitations. He wanted to acknowledge the genuine service and sacrifice of previous monarchs, while explaining why he believed a different approach was now necessary. The speech needed to be both personal and political, emotional and rational, revolutionary and respectful. As he worked on the speech, Charles received an unexpected phone call from his sister, Princess Anne. She had heard rumors about his unusual behavior from palace staff and was calling to express her concern and offer her support. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest exchanges the siblings had shared since childhood, and listened as Charles explained his growing conviction that the monarchy needed fundamental reform to remain relevant and meaningful. She challenged some of his assumptions and questioned the wisdom of such radical action, but she also acknowledged her own occasional frustrations with the constraints of royal life. What surprised both of them was the discovery that they shared many concerns about the effectiveness of their traditional roles. The conversation with and forced Charles to articulate his vision more clearly than he had done before. He spoke about his desire to create a new model of public service that would combine the symbolic power of monarchy with direct engagement in the pressing issues of the day. He envisioned a role that would allow him to advocate for environmental protection, social justice, and political reform while maintaining the respect and affection of the people. Anne's response was characteristically direct. She pointed out the enormous risks involved in such an unprecedented action and questioned whether Charles had fully considered the impact on other members of the royal family. But she also admitted that she admired his willingness to prioritize principle over personal comfort and expressed her belief that their mother, despite her dedication to traditional monarchy, would have understood and perhaps even supported his reasoning. That afternoon brought another crucial conversation, this time with the Prime Minister. Charles had requested an emergency meeting, knowing that the government needed to be informed of his intentions before any public announcement was made. The Prime Minister arrived at the palace with considerable concern, aware that urgent royal summons rarely brought good news for the political establishment. The meeting that followed was unlike any in the history of relations between the crown and government. Charles spoke with unprecedented candor about his belief that the constitutional monarchy had become a barrier to effective leadership rather than a source of stability and continuity. He outlined his conviction that the nation's challenges required more direct and engaged leadership than his current role allowed. The Prime Minister's initial response was one of alarm and confusion. The entire system of British government was predicated on the assumption of royal neutrality and the separation of symbolic and executive power. Charles's proposal threatened to upend these fundamental assumptions and create constitutional chaos at a time when the nation could least afford additional uncertainty. However, as the conversation continued, the Prime Minister began to recognize the sincerity and thoughtfulness behind the king's proposal. Charles was not acting impulsively or out of personal frustration. He had clearly spent considerable time thinking through the implications of his decision and developing a coherent rationale for his actions. While the Prime Minister remained deeply concerned about the practical consequences, he found himself respecting the king's willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for what he believed to be the greater good. The discussion extended well into the evening as both men grappled with the unprecedented nature of the situation. Charles explained his vision for a reformed monarchy that would maintain its symbolic importance while allowing for more direct engagement with contemporary challenges. The Prime Minister outlined the enormous constitutional and political complications that would inevitably arise from such a dramatic departure from tradition. What became clear during their extended conversation was that both men shared many concerns about the effectiveness of current institutions and the need for political renewal. They disagreed about methods and timing, but they found common ground in their assessment of the challenges facing the nation and their commitment to serving the public interest. As the meeting concluded, Charles made a commitment that would prove crucial in the days to come. He agreed to provide the government with advance notice of his intentions and to work cooperatively to minimize the disruption that would inevitably follow his announcement. He also accepted the Prime Minister's request for additional time to prepare the government's response and to consult with constitutional experts about the legal implications of his decision. That evening, Charles experienced something he had not felt since childhood: the excitement of anticipating an unknown future. For the first time in his adult life, he was making decisions based on his own convictions rather than inherited expectations. The uncertainty was daunting, but it was also liberating in a way that surprised him with its intensity. His final act of the day was to call Prince William once more, this time to inform him of the concrete steps that were being taken to implement the decision they had discussed the previous evening. William's response was more measured than before. He had spent the day consulting with advisors and beginning to prepare for the enormous responsibilities that would soon fall to him. The conversation between father and son was emotional and complex. Both men understood that they were participating in a moment that would be remembered as a turning point in the history of the British monarchy. Charles expressed his confidence in William's ability to handle the challenges ahead, while William acknowledged his father's right to follow his conscience, even when it created enormous difficulties for everyone else. As Charles prepared for bed on this third day of his transformation, he felt a mixture of anticipation and peace that he had never experienced as king. The die was cast. The decision was made. The future, uncertain as it might be, would be shaped by authentic conviction rather than dutiful compliance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the beginning of a public process that would shock the world, but Charles faced it with the confidence that comes from acting in accordance with one's deepest beliefs and values. The palace settled into its nightly routine around a king who was no longer the same person who had awakened 3 days earlier. The transformation that had begun with doubt and questioning was now approaching its decisive moment, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The fourth day arrived with an electric tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Buckingham Palace. Charles awoke with the crystal-clear knowledge that today would be the day of reckoning, the moment when private contemplation would transform into public action. He had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, and now the time for deliberation had passed. Today, he would announce his decision to the world. Charles began the morning by finalizing his speech, incorporating the feedback and insights he had gathered from his conversations with family members, advisors, and government officials. The final version was more polished than his earlier drafts, but it retained the personal passion and authentic conviction that had driven his decision. Every word had been carefully chosen to explain his reasoning while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of his actions. The speech opened with an acknowledgement of the sacred nature of the coronation oath and his deep respect for the institution of monarchy. However, it quickly moved to his central argument that true loyalty to the crown required adapting to contemporary needs rather than rigidly preserving historical forms. Charles had crafted language that honored tradition while explaining why he believed the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant and effective. The most challenging section of the speech dealt with his specific criticisms of the current system. Charles had decided to be direct about his frustrations with the constraints of constitutional monarchy, particularly its requirement of political neutrality on issues he considered too important for silence. He spoke about climate change as an existential threat that demanded urgent action, not the careful diplomatic language typically associated with royal communications. As Charles reviewed the speech one final time, he received a visit from Camilla, who had arrived at the palace early to provide moral support during what would certainly be the most difficult day of his reign. The queen consort had initially been shocked by her husband's intentions, but she had come to understand and even admire the courage required for such an unprecedented action. Camilla's presence provided Charles with the emotional anchor he needed as the day's events began to unfold. She listened as he read through the speech, offering suggestions for clarification and emotional support as he prepared to face the inevitable storm that would follow his announcement. Her quiet strength reminded him that he was not facing this challenge alone, even though the ultimate responsibility remained entirely his own. The morning was spent in a series of final consultations with key advisors and government officials. Sir Thompson arrived with a detailed briefing on the practical arrangements that would need to be implemented immediately following the announcement. The logistics were staggering in their complexity, involving everything from security protocols to media management to constitutional procedures that had never been tested in modern times. Charles also met with the heads of the Commonwealth nations via secure video conference, informing them of his intentions and beginning the process of managing the international implications of his decision. The responses varied dramatically, from shock and dismay to curiosity and, even, in some cases, grudging admiration for his willingness to challenge established norms. The most difficult conversation was with the Governor-General of Canada, who expressed serious concerns about the constitutional crisis that would inevitably follow Charles's announcement. The king acknowledged these concerns while maintaining his conviction that short-term disruption was preferable to the long-term decline of institutions that refused to evolve with changing times. By midday, the arrangements for the announcement had been finalized. Charles would address the nation at 8 p.m. that evening, speaking from his private study rather than the more formal settings typically used for royal addresses. The decision to use an intimate setting was deliberate, intended to emphasize the personal nature of his decision and his desire to speak directly to the people as a fellow citizen rather than as a distant sovereign. The afternoon brought an unexpected emotional challenge when Charles received a phone call from his youngest brother, Prince Edward. Edward had heard rumors about the impending announcement and was calling to express his deep concern about the impact on the entire royal family. The conversation that followed was painful for both brothers, as Edward struggled to understand how Charles could contemplate actions that would inevitably reflect on all of them. Charles found himself defending his decision once again, but this time to someone whose primary concern was the preservation of family reputation rather than constitutional or political considerations. Edward argued that the monarchy had survived and thrived precisely because it had remained above the fray of contemporary politics, and he feared that Charles's actions would destroy the carefully maintained mystique that gave the institution its power and influence. The conversation forced Charles to confront one of the most painful aspects of his decision. By choosing to follow his conscience, he was inevitably subjecting his entire family to scrutiny and criticism they had not chosen and did not deserve. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but his conviction remained unshaken that authentic leadership sometimes required accepting such personal costs. As evening approached, the palace became a hub of intense activity as staff prepared for the unprecedented announcement. Security was heightened, media protocols were activated, and senior advisors took their positions to manage the immediate aftermath of what everyone understood would be a historic moment. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation and anxiety about how the public would respond to such an extraordinary departure from royal tradition. Charles spent the final hour before his address in quiet contemplation, reviewing his notes one last time and mentally preparing himself for the storm that would inevitably follow. He understood that his words would be analyzed and criticized by constitutional experts, political commentators, and ordinary citizens around the world. The pressure was enormous, but he felt a sense of peace that came from the knowledge that he was acting according to his deepest convictions. At precisely 8 p.m., Charles stepped in front of the cameras to deliver the most important speech of his life. His opening words immediately signaled that this would be unlike any royal address in modern history. He spoke directly to the camera, without the formal distance typically maintained in such communications, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and personal connection. The king began by acknowledging the unusual nature of his address and his awareness that his words would surprise and perhaps shock many of his listeners. He then launched into his carefully crafted explanation of his decision, speaking with a passion and conviction that was unmistakably authentic. The speech was personal yet principled, emotional yet rational, revolutionary yet respectful of tradition. Charles spoke about his love for his country and his deep commitment to serving its people, but he also acknowledged his growing conviction that the current structure of the monarchy prevented him from providing the kind of leadership the nation needed. He was direct about his frustration with the constraints of constitutional neutrality on issues he considered too important for silence. The most powerful section of the speech came when Charles addressed the climate crisis directly, speaking with an urgency and passion that would have been impossible within the traditional constraints of royal protocol. He described climate change as the defining challenge of our time and expressed his belief that leadership required the courage to speak truth about difficult issues, even when it meant abandoning comfortable neutrality. As the speech continued, Charles outlined his vision for a new model of public service that would maintain the symbolic power of monarchy while allowing for direct engagement with contemporary challenges. He spoke about his desire to advocate for environmental protection, social justice, and political reform, while maintaining the respect and affection of the people through authentic rather than ceremonial leadership. The conclusion of the speech was perhaps its most remarkable element. Charles announced that he would be stepping away from the traditional role of constitutional monarch, not to abandon his duties, but to fulfill them in a way that aligned with his conscience and the urgent needs of the time. He spoke about the difficulty of his decision and his awareness of the disruption it would cause, but he also expressed his confidence that sometimes the greatest service requires the courage to chart an unknown course. As Charles finished speaking and the cameras stopped rolling, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension unlike anything he had ever experienced. The words were spoken. The decision was public. There could be no turning back. The reaction would come quickly, and he knew that the next few days would test his conviction and resolve in ways he could barely imagine. The immediate response from palace staff was a mixture of admiration and concern. Many of those who had worked closely with the king expressed their respect for his courage, while acknowledging their worry about the challenges that lay ahead. The atmosphere in the palace that night was unlike anything in its long history, charged with the electricity that comes from witnessing a truly historic moment. As Charles retired to his private quarters that night, he carried with him the knowledge that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Tomorrow would bring reactions from around the world, and the beginning of a process that would fundamentally alter not just his own life, but the very nature of the British monarchy itself. The fifth day dawned with a cacophony of responses from around the world that exceeded even Charles's expectations for the magnitude of reaction his announcement would provoke. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from media outlets, government officials, and ordinary citizens, while social media platforms buzzed with debates that ranged from outraged condemnation to enthusiastic support. The king awoke to discover that his decision had indeed changed everything, just as he had anticipated. Charles began the morning by reading through a selection of the thousands of messages that had already poured in from across the Commonwealth and beyond. The responses were as varied as they were passionate, reflecting the deep divisions his announcement had revealed within British society and the broader international community. Some letters praised his courage and authenticity, while others accused him of betraying his sacred oath and abandoning his duties at a time when stability was desperately needed. One letter that particularly moved Charles came from a group of environmental scientists who expressed their gratitude for his willingness to speak directly about climate change and their hope that his new approach to public service would inspire more authentic leadership on environmental issues. Another came from a teacher in Wales who wrote about her students' excitement at seeing their king choose principle over protocol, viewing his decision as evidence that even the most traditional institutions could evolve and grow. However, Charles was equally affected by the letters expressing disappointment and concern. A veteran who had served in the Falklands War wrote about his feeling of betrayal, arguing that the monarchy represented continuity and stability that the nation desperately needed during uncertain times. An elderly woman from Scotland expressed her sadness at what she saw as the abandonment of values and traditions that had sustained the country through its greatest challenges. The morning brought a series of urgent meetings as government officials, palace advisors, and constitutional experts scrambled to understand the implications of Charles's unprecedented decision. The Prime Minister arrived early for what would prove to be one of the most consequential conversations in modern British political history. The two men faced the reality that they were navigating completely uncharted territory, with no precedents to guide their decisions. The discussion focused primarily on the practical questions that Charles's announcement had raised. What would be his new role and title? How would the succession proceed? What changes would be needed to existing constitutional arrangements? The complexity was staggering, involving not just British law, but the constitutions of every Commonwealth realm where Charles had served as head of state. Charles outlined his vision for his transformed role with greater specificity than he had been able to achieve in his public address. He spoke about becoming a different kind of public figure, one who would maintain the symbolic importance of royal heritage while engaging directly in advocacy for causes he considered crucial to the nation's future. He envisioned a position that would combine elements of elder statesman, environmental advocate, and social reformer. The Prime Minister listened with a mixture of admiration and exasperation as Charles described his plans. While he respected the king's convictions and courage, he was also acutely aware of the enormous practical challenges that would need to be resolved. The government would need to work quickly to prevent constitutional chaos, while managing the political fallout from such an unprecedented situation. One of the most pressing issues was the question of succession. Prince William would clearly need to assume the throne much sooner than anyone had anticipated, but the process would need to be managed carefully to maintain stability and legitimacy. Charles expressed his complete confidence in his son's ability to handle these responsibilities, while acknowledging the unfair burden this placed on William's shoulders. The afternoon brought meetings with representatives from various Commonwealth nations, many of whom were struggling to understand how to respond to Charles's decision. Some expressed support for his right to follow his conscience, while others were concerned about the implications for their own constitutional arrangements. The complexity of managing these relationships added another layer of challenge to an already unprecedented situation. Charles found himself energized rather than exhausted by these challenging conversations. For the first time since his coronation, he felt fully engaged with the issues and responsibilities before him. The freedom to speak honestly about his convictions and plans, rather than maintaining careful diplomatic neutrality, was liberating in ways he had not fully anticipated. The most significant development of the day came when Charles received an invitation that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. The United Nations Secretary-General requested a private meeting to discuss Charles's potential role as a special envoy for climate action. The invitation represented exactly the kind of direct engagement with global challenges that Charles had been seeking, and it validated his belief that stepping away from traditional monarchy would open new opportunities for meaningful service. That evening, Charles made the decision that would complete his transformation from traditional monarch to authentic public servant. He walked out of Buckingham Palace, not in secrecy or anger, but in full view of the gathered media and curious crowds. The symbolic power of this action was immense. He was literally walking away from the institution that had defined his life while walking toward an uncertain but authentic future. The walk itself was relatively brief, taking him from the palace gates to a waiting car that would transport him to a private residence where he would begin planning his new life. But the significance of those steps could not be overstated. Each stride represented a choice to prioritize personal integrity over institutional expectation, authentic service over ceremonial duty. The crowds that had gathered outside the palace represented the full spectrum of public opinion about his decision. Some cheered and applauded as he walked past, viewing his actions as courageous and principled. Others stood in stunned silence, struggling to process the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. A few shouted criticism and expressions of disappointment, reflecting the genuine anger many felt about his departure from traditional royal duties. Charles walked with dignity and purpose, acknowledging the crowds while maintaining the composure that had characterized his public life for decades. The expression on his face was one of peace and determination rather than defiance or anger. He understood that many of those present disagreed with his decision, but he also believed that his actions demonstrated a kind of authentic leadership that the country desperately needed. The media coverage of his walk was immediate and extensive, with commentators struggling to find historical parallels for such an unprecedented action. Some compared it to King Edward VIII's abdication, but Charles's decision was fundamentally different. He was not abandoning responsibility, but rather redefining it according to contemporary needs and his personal convictions. As Charles settled into his temporary residence that evening, he reflected on the events of the past 5 days and the journey that had brought him to this moment. The transformation had been more rapid and comprehensive than he had initially imagined, but each step had felt natural and inevitable once he had committed himself to authentic leadership. The phone calls and messages that continued to pour in throughout the evening confirmed that his decision had indeed sparked the kind of national conversation about leadership, service, and institutional reform that he had hoped to encourage. While the responses were deeply divided, they were also passionate and engaged in ways that suggested his actions had touched something fundamental in the national consciousness. Late that night, Charles received a call from Prince William, who had spent the day managing the immediate aftermath of his father's announcement and beginning to prepare for his own accelerated path to the throne. The conversation was emotional and complex, reflecting both the personal and public dimensions of the unprecedented situation they were navigating together. William expressed his admiration for his father's courage while acknowledging the enormous challenges that lay ahead for the entire royal family. Charles, in turn, expressed his confidence in his son's ability to provide the kind of leadership the monarchy needed while pursuing his own vision of authentic public service. Both men understood that they were participating in a historic transformation of one of the world's oldest institutions. As Charles prepared for sleep in unfamiliar surroundings, he felt a sense of completion that had been absent from his life for months. The decision that had begun as a vague sense of dissatisfaction had evolved into concrete action that aligned with his deepest values and convictions. The future remained uncertain, but it was a future he had chosen rather than one that had been imposed upon him by birth and tradition. The man who had once been defined entirely by his inherited role was now free to discover what kind of leader he could become when guided by conscience rather than protocol. The transformation was complete, but in many ways, Charles understood that his real work was just beginning. He had walked away from the crown, but he had walked toward a future where his service to his country and the world could be guided by authenticity, passion, and an unwavering commitment to the challenges that would define the 21st century. The palace behind him continued its ancient routines, but it would never be quite the same. Charles had demonstrated that even the most traditional institutions were not immune to the transformative power of individual conscience and the courage to choose authentic service over comfortable conformity. His walk out of Buckingham Palace was not an ending, but a beginning of a new chapter in both his own life and the long history of the British monarchy.